Well, thanks everyone for joining this morning. It is a pleasure to be part of the Cotton and Coffee. It's been a couple years since I've given a presentation here. So as Stacy mentioned, I think it's a very timely topic. A lot of the U.S. cotton belt hasn't gotten planted yet. The exception probably be in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas and possibly the coastal bend of Texas. But still, I think there's some opportunities here for growers to save some money in a year that's really tight on profitability. I think this is definitely an area that growers can save some money and help with those margins. As Stacy mentioned, I'm Director of Ag Research. My focus areas are weed management, nitrogen management, soil health, seed quality, and then just general agronomy. And the other nutrients are shared, potassium, phosphorus, those are shared with the co-director, Evie Chaconis. So really what I do at Cotton Incorporated is I help direct research, and today we're specifically going to talk about some of the research related to nitrogen management. But I need to give recognition to a lot of the people across the Cotton Belt, the researchers and extension folks with the universities and USDA that actually implement the research. And this is just a portion of those individuals. I saw Amy Baumgardner and some others on the call as well that also work in nutrient management. So this is a group primarily pictured here that are working on a project we just wrapped up in 2024, looking at increasing nitrogen use efficiency. And then the stars here are for individuals that contributed to this presentation. Again, we don't do the research here at Cotton Incorporated. We support the research through our research colleagues and extension folks with universities and USDA. And as we go through this presentation, I'll be happy to, I'll be watching the chat and looking for questions. So if you have anything as we go through, I'll be happy to try to answer those. So kind of to get everyone on a level playing field here, we need to talk about what is or how are we defining nitrogen use efficiency. And basically, what percent of the nitrogen fertilizer goes out there is converted to, a pound of lint or a pound of seed cotton. And what is that conversion? And some of the research that was done by Kevin Bronson back in 2008 showed that cotton has a nitrogen use efficiency of about 43%. So about 43% of that nitrogen that's being applied is actually getting converted in that plant to something that we can sell. So that leaves a lot of room for improvement. But looking at it, we're right in line kind of with our colleagues that farm similarly. The Australians are kind of in that same nitrogen use efficiency range. So if our nitrogen use efficiency is 43%, what happens to that remaining 57% of the nitrogen? And that's kind of what the talk is going to focus on today. What can we do to improve that nitrogen use efficiency? Every pound of nitrogen is, an input cost for the growers. How is, nitrogen loss? Basically, ammonium volatilization. We'll talk about that on a couple slides. Nitrogen leaching is another one that's kind of much more difficult to quantify. So I'm not going to talk about that a lot today, but we need to kind of remember that in the background. Can also lose nitrogen from runoff. And then what we're going to spend a lot of the presentation time on today is, nitrogen that's actually in the soil that can be utilized by those cotton plants, which means that's nitrogen fertilizer that you don't need to put out there. And that's in, ammonium form, nitrate forms, but also organic nitrogen, crop residue, organic matter, things like that. So kind of, why do we want to improve nitrogen use efficiency? As mentioned, it's directly related to grower profitability. On average, somewhere between 7 to 12% of the variable cost for growing cotton is in nitrogen fertilizer. And that can be, anywhere from 40 to, $80+ per acre. So if we can cut that nitrogen rate 25, 50%, we're looking at pretty decent savings there. And I think by the end of the presentation, you'll realize that there's definitely opportunities in a lot of situations to cut your nitrogen rate without negatively impacting your yield. Other, environmental reasons, reducing leaching and runoff that negatively impact water quality and also greenhouse gas emissions. So a lot of people don't realize it, but we're greenhouse gas emissions from cotton, about 2/3 of that actually comes from nitrogen fertilizer, whether that's from producing the nitrogen fertilizer or loss of nitrogen fertilizer from the cotton field. So as we look at sustainable cotton production, this is a major area where we can improve our sustainability story. So, synthetic cotton, synthetic fertilizer has been produced really since post-World War II, so the 40s, 50s, and 60s. There's been a lot of research that has been done in this area, and you kind of ask the question, well, why don't we already know everything? And sorry, I'm just throwing my speaker up a little bit here. And that's partially because the nitrogen cycle is quite complex. On the left here is a diagram of the nitrogen cycle. With farming, we particularly focus on the fertilizer component here on the right side, and we don't typically pay a whole lot of attention to much of the rest of the nitrogen cycle. But there's a lot of complexity going on there, including organic nitrogen from crop residue, peanuts, soybeans, things like that. Also the amount of ammonium and nitrates that are in the soils, which is kind of what much of the focus is going to be on today. And as a grower up here on the upper right, I mean, essentially you're looking at optimizing the amount of nitrogen uptake while trying to minimize the other loss factors that we mentioned earlier, the leaching, the volatilization, and denitrification. And then for many, many years now, people have been talking about the 4 R's, the right source, the right rate, the right time, the right place. I'm going to focus a little bit on that because some points are vitally important, but a big portion is going to be on nitrogen that's in the soil and how you can kind of credit that nitrogen and reduce your nitrogen application rates. So this slide here is the slide from John Lindemuth out in West Tennessee, and he and I shared we were co-presenters at the Cotton and Rice Conference one year talking about nitrogen management when nitrogen prices were a bit higher. And John got up and was talking about the variable rate application of nitrogen within his fields in West Tennessee. And over here on the left, you can see 2008, where John was doing variable rate nitrogen application based off soil type and soil residual nitrogens, where he was drawing things in with a highlighter. And then, of course, today the technology has advanced dramatically, both on the application, but also the software and things like that have made it much easier for variable rate application. So this kind of gets to the right placement and the right timing of fertilizer and things that can be done to improve efficiency. And other things that can be done to improve efficiency on the placement side, but also there's lots of questions that come about on, some of the nitrogen stabilizer, the urease inhibitors, the nitrification inhibitors. Are those worth it? What value do they bring to the grower for helping to improve nitrogen use efficiency? And this is a location from Hunter Frame in Virginia. Looking at the effectiveness of different application methods on the left here, both of urea and UAN, and basically, and then the y-axis here is the amount percent of nitrogen loss due to volatilization, basically. So this is if you applied 100 pounds of the fertilizer in this situation with a surface broadcast application of urea on these Virginia soils, are losing close to 35 to 40% of that is being lost as ammonia. So it's going up into the air and has literally no value to you as the farmer. So, surface application is probably the worst as far as efficiency goes. In these Virginia soils, surface broadcast urea was worse, and then surface broadcast of UAN was second. And then you have the banded urea applications and UAN applications here kind of toward the middle. And then here on the bottom is the subsurface banded application of those products. And you can see minimal amount of loss due to volatility when it's, injected or banded up, subsurface banded. So just something to keep in mind if you're applying urea and even UAN, how much you're losing just due to volatility. Now on the right side here, it's kind of a similar setup, nitrogen loss due to ammonium. And then they included the different nitrogen stabilizer, urease inhibitors, and nitrification inhibitors, the NBPT, the nitropyrene, and the ESN, with both urea and UAN. And you can still see with the urea plus nitropyrene, they're still losing close to 40% due to volatility. The urea plus the NBPT did help some, reduced it 10 or 20% compared to the urea alone. And then you can see the UAN plus nitropyrene. So there are some opportunities to decrease the amount of volatility using some of these products, but none of them even reach the level of subsurface application, or in the case, even possibly the surface broadcast or the surface banded application. So again, we can dive into this in more detail if you have questions at the end, but just going over a broad overview. The same study was conducted in West Texas, but also in the Delta region. This is West Texas, conducted by Katie Lewis. Exact same setup on the left side here is the subsurface broadcast urea, and then subsurface banded is the second there. But on these high pH soils, you can see losing upwards of 60% of the nitrogen applied. It's volatilizing off those fields on those higher pH soils. And then surface banded urea was second there. Again, high pH soils causes more volatility. And then you can see the other applications here. Again, with the subsurface being right down here, it's losing, less than 10%. And then on the right again, these are the different urea and UAN with the different products there. And they definitely did help, especially on those high pH soils, and reducing the volatility, but still losing upwards of 30+% of that fertilizer due to volatility. So kind of moving on to other ways that nitrogen use efficiency, has been improved actually as we've adopted higher yielding varieties. This is some work again that Irish Bayan has done along with Glenn Ritchie and Katie Lewis out in West Texas, where they compared historic cultivars, here I'm circling, versus modern cultivars. And basically what's shown here, they did it for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and the other nutrients. But basically our modern cultivars, our higher yielding cotton cultivars, are considerably more efficient at handling nitrogen, using that nitrogen, improving nitrogen use efficiency than the older cultivars. So just by identifying and planting higher yielding varieties, you're ultimately increasing your nitrogen use efficiency. And then that kind of has led to, some of the other research that has been going on for 25+ years, looking at kind of what's been going on in the soil. This research was funded back in the late 90s, early 2000s by Cotton Incorporated and through the Texas State Support Committee, where the scientists there, Robert Lemon, Mark McFarland, and others, went out into growers' fields and actually collected soil samples and then quantified the amount of soil nitrate. They went down to 3 and 4 feet sampling and just looked at the number of sites there, how much nitrogen was in the soil, but also, they put out a nitrogen rate study to determine, were those going to be responsive to nitrogen application. And then the following studies were kind of done in a similar way, where they compared, untreated check, 0 pounds of nitrogen, all the way up 0, 40, 80, 120, 160 pounds of nitrogen. So if you look at that kind of nitrogen rate response in the early 2000s from those 50 grower fields in Texas, and we'll kind of dive into this a little bit more detail in the following slides, only 24% of those fields responded. And when I say response, only 24% of them, the fields yielded higher, compared the untreated check or 0 nitrogen compared to the application of nitrogen fertilizer. We know cotton needs nitrogen, the point being, in many cases, it's in the soil, and that plant is able to utilize that nitrogen without additional nitrogen being applied. Similar study was conducted in 2010 with extension cotton specialists across the cotton belt. They had 16 field trials. 50% of those locations responded, and we'll get into details on that. And then as I came on board at Cotton Incorporated in 2019 and on into 2020, started looking at what we could do to, again, revisiting some of the nitrogen refinement, what we could do to improve nitrogen use efficiency. And we'll dive into more detail on this last study. But I just kind of want to give an overview of the lack of responsiveness in many of these field sites. So from that early work conducted by Robert Lemon and Mark McFarland in Texas, again, where they surveyed right around 54 fields, which is highlighted here over from 1998 to 2004. Of those fields, 61% of those fields had over 100 pounds of nitrate nitrogen in the soil. So essentially enough nitrogen in the soil in the top, 3 feet to make 2 bale cotton. And again, as those field trials were implemented, only 24% of those locations actually responded to nitrogen fertilizer. And then the other thing that they pointed out within this, found in the research and pointed out in the publication, probably less so in the Delta and maybe the Southeast, but in many of the wells in Texas, which is where this research was conducted, a lot of the irrigation water also has nitrates in it. And depending on what your part per million of nitrates are in your irrigation water, you can actually get a considerable amount of nitrate from your irrigation water alone. So just for example, we'll kind of take the middle of the road here. If you had 12 part per million and you applied 12 inches of water, and you had 20 part per million, that's 55 pounds of nitrogen that's coming through the irrigation water. So there's definitely opportunities to credit that nitrogen as well. So kind of then moving on to the 2009, 2010 research that was done across the cotton belt. There were 16 sites, as I mentioned. Only 8 of those sites responded to nitrogen, the application of nitrogen fertilizer. Again, we know cotton needs nitrogen. The point being, there's nitrogen obviously in the soil that plant is able to uptake and to produce good yields without nitrogen fertilizer being applied. But here we're looking at the responsive sites. And a couple of key points here is, without any nitrogen fertilizer being applied at all, we were still obtaining, over 1,100 pounds of lint across those 8 different sites. So there's more nitrogen there that we haven't even been accounting for with the nitrates alone. We did get this is a responsive curve, as I mentioned, the 8 responsive sites. Kind of the yield was optimized at, right around 80 to 100 pounds, which falls in line. We know cotton needs somewhere between, 40 to 45 pounds of N per bale is what it actually needs. But the interesting point here is what many of you may kind of expect, over application of nitrogen can actually decrease yields, in addition to causing other problems, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this alone, from a profitability perspective, is a reason to get that nitrogen rate right. That's fertilizer applied and accounting for the amount of nitrogen that's in the soil. So again, just kind of summary of some of this, 50% of the locations responded, over 1,100 pounds of yield without any nitrogen applied. And not accounting for the nitrogen in the soil actually led to lower yields. And then, of course, this was across from Arizona all the way to the East Coast, these different sites, but there are obviously regional and weather differences that occur there. One other interesting component of it is they took into account the, soil type, and depending on the soil type, you get kind of a different nitrogen response curve. So down here on the bottom, it's applied nitrogen plus what was in the soil. And you can see a loam here, you actually got a pretty nice response curve as the amount of nitrogen went up. But if you had like a silty clay loam in this situation, basically it was nearly a flat curve, and you actually started seeing some of that negative response with over application of nitrogen fertilizer. So I guess kind of to the point being, nearly every field has some variability in soil type. So there's definitely opportunities here for variable rate application as well. And I think another important point that came out of that study was, we kind of need to recalibrate ourselves on what cotton needs to look like at the end of the year. The optimum yield here at this particular field was actually between 40 and 80 pounds per acre. This had about 45 pounds residual nitrates in the soil. So it was there before the study started. But we can see, 0 pounds here, 40. Things are still a bit yellow, but probably really where we kind of want cotton to look like. 80 and then 120, extremely lush. So that's kind of laid out there. But I think we kind of need to think about recalibrating. Cotton is a perennial plant. It naturally sheds its leaves at the, in the fall. It naturally wants to move those nutrients from the lower canopy to the upper canopy and into those cotton bolls as those bolls mature. So I think we kind of need to think about, we don't need a crop that looks like this 120 here, very lush and green at the end of the season. We want that plant to start some level of natural senescence right toward the end of the season. So that kind of leads to the point of, kind of detriments from over applying. And we'll hit on some of these again later as well. But basically some of the detriments to over applying the nitrogen, not crediting that nitrogen that's in the soil, increased fertilizer cost, other things, increased PGR applications, increased harvest aid costs when you have the, really lush plants at the end of the year. It's just harder to take those leaves off with your harvest aids. So you're looking at more input costs there. Again, I showed the diminishing returns from over application of nitrogen. And then you can also run into some fiber quality issues. Generally speaking, over or excessive amounts of nitrogen delays maturity, which can lead to immature fiber. And, depending on where you are in the cotton belt, kind of that northern latitude, you could decrease your mite to a discount range. Higher leaf grades, mainly because of poor defoliation. And then you can also have increased yellowness. And another important point that, affects other parts of the industry is you increase that nitrogen rate, you actually produce less seed or less oil in that seed. Your protein content goes up, but your oil content goes down with excessive nitrogen applications. Kind of other indirect effects that need to be considered. When you're fertilizing that crop, you're also fertilizing any weeds that may still be out there, which can increase weed growth and seed production. Typically see increased insect pests and increased diseases with excessive nitrogen. And then kind of on the sustainability or environmental front, as we talked about, your increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Again, 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions for cotton is coming from nitrogen fertilizer. And then the point of nitrate leaching. So after moving to Cotton Incorporated and kind of seeing a bigger picture, because I worked for about 15 years in Texas as a state cotton specialist, and I was focused on Texas and their recommendations. But after coming to Cotton Incorporated, I was really surprised at the diversity in nitrogen recommendations from state to state. And we'll look at some of those in a little bit. But it still kind of bothered me because I was part of that Extension Cotton Specialist project, is why only 50% of our locations are not responding to nitrogen. And then also, even if we do account for the nitrate alone in the soil, how are we getting 2 bale yields with 0 applied in? So to me, there had to be another nitrogen source out there those plants were using. So that kind of led into the next project. And then Another question I had was kind of why isn't the adoption of crediting soil nitrogen more common? I do know some guys are doing it. I mentioned John Lindemood earlier who does it, but why isn't that adoption more common? And I think one reason is because there's not confidence in when there's going to be a response to the nitrogen application and when there's not. And when in doubt, we all are going to be more risk averse and probably over apply that nitrogen fertilizer. So we're trying to get at it, identify which fields are going to be responsive as well. So kind of moving into, the recommendations by state. And I just want to touch on some of the recommendations that are out there. And when looking at this, very few have really accounted for increase in higher yielding varieties, change in seed size, increase in no-till and other conservation practices, cover crops, things like that. But here is just an example of kind of the range, even at a low yield potential. We're looking at some states recommend 43 pounds, while nearly adjacent states are recommending 70 pounds per acre. And then, of course, as you take that out to, a yield base of 2 bales or even higher, that spread becomes even wider. So literally across state lines, the recommendations vary anywhere from 40 to 50 pounds per acre. Is what the recommendations are. So again, ultimately with this project, this Beltwide project we're currently wrapping up, we're trying to hopefully look at, having more of a regional recommendation rather than state recommendations. And then some other recommendations that are literally state side by side that are a bit contradictory. They do integrate some of the soil components, which I think, any future recommendations probably will. But Mississippi recommends 50 to 80 pounds of N per bale per acre with higher rates for the heavier soils. And then 120 to 140 pounds for 2 bales with no reference to the soil type. And then Tennessee, again, right across the state line, 30 to 60 pounds of N for bottomland soils and 60 to 80 on upland soils, which again, somewhat even a contradiction on the soil type there between states. And then Tennessee recommends 60 to 80 pounds per acre if following clover or veg, like a cover crop system. So, there's some very good components to each of these. I just think there would be some value if we can ever get to a consistent recommendation that covers a given geography, which is hopefully where we'll get. So kind of circling back to the nitrogen response, the nitrogen cycle, again, very complex. The previous studies have focused on, the fertilizer application and the soil nitrate that's in the soil. Again, there's a lot of places that were getting 2 bale yields with no nitrogen applied. And even when accounting for the nitrates, we're still getting really good yields. So there had to be nitrogen coming from somewhere else in this cycle. So the focus really of these studies have really tried to bring everything together to include the nitrate, the ammonium that's in the soil, and the organic N that's in the soil. From your organic matter, your crop rotations with legumes, manure applications, poultry litter applications, and things like that. So as we got into this study, one important component is we started looking at the amount of ammonium in the soil. And in many cases, the soils had more ammonium in the soil than they did nitrate. And ammonium is readily taken up by cotton, as is nitrate. So we have 2 very good sources of nitrogen there, inorganic sources of nitrogen in the soil. Again, most locations having more ammonium in the soil than nitrates. So that kind of led into the study that started in 2020 across the cotton belt. And again, we had a nitrogen application rate of 40, 80, 120, and 160 at all of these locations, and then took soil cores down to basically 2, if not 3 feet in many situations, tested for ammonium, nitrates, along with other nutrients, but also the organic components, looking at the crop residue and the organic matter in that top 4 inches and trying to account for that. So, the previous studies were 50 plus sites. Cotton Specialist one was 16. For this one, we're up to 141 sites across 12 states. South Carolina had a whole lot of locations compared to the other states, but they had other funding sources that they were collecting a lot more data there. And similarly, North Carolina did as well. But you can see the spread here, basically across the Cotton Belt, we had locations at all major cotton producing states that participated in this trial. And of those 142 sites, only 50% of those responded to nitrogen applications. So again, similar story as we've already talked about. So a lot of this data has not been analyzed. Again, it just wrapped up at the end of 2024, tremendous amount of data with a number of site years, but just kind of diving into some overviews of the data. So this is the mean lint yield for non-responsive sites, meaning we put out nitrogen fertilizer, but where we applied nitrogen fertilizer didn't yield any better than where no nitrogen fertilizer was applied. And you can see we had a good yield range here from low yielding environments, to very high yielding environments. So we had some 2-3 bale cotton yields again with no response to nitrogen. So 0 yielded as well as 40, 80, 120, or 160 pounds of nitrogen applied. Now, if we go to the responsive sites, meaning, may not, it responded, the yields were higher at 40, 80, 120, or possibly 160. But if you look at 2/3 of those sites, we obtained over 70% of the yield potential with 0 nitrogen being applied. So kind of the point is there is some downside risk to under applying nitrogen, but it's not a tremendous amount. Again, because in most cases, there's quite a bit of capacity in those soils to provide nitrogen fertilizer or nitrogen, organic or inorganic nitrogen. And these are just some examples from some of the early data that was collected of the trial. These are the inorganic N sources, so nitrogen and ammonium sources. And this is the individual data at 0 to 4 inches, 0 to 4 inches here on the left, 4 to 12, and then 12 to 24 inches in parts per million. So you can see I just kind of took an average here where they were. We had in the top 4 inches, it ranged from very little nitrogen up to well over 40 pounds per acre in the top 4 inches. And then we move over to 4 to 12 inches. We're looking at anywhere from most of it somewhere in that 25 pound, but even up to 40 pounds of N. And then if you go deeper, we have lower parts per million, but so we're looking at about 20 pounds of N available. So you can see the scattering here. Again, as I mentioned, it varies by location, varies by soil type, but the point is you collect the soil, have it tested for, the ammonium sources, then, you can credit that nitrogen. So if you add it up, kind of took the average here across these samples with depth, 0 to 24 inches, you're looking at a cumulative of 67 pounds of plant available N from ammonium and nitrate. That doesn't include the amount that's coming from the organic matter. So that kind of leads to the next slide. Alan Franz-Lubers at USDA here in North Carolina did all the soil biological activity, which estimates the amount of nitrogen that would be available from the organic sources. And if we just take kind of the mean here, we had, you're looking at 20 to 40 pounds of plant available nitrogen there from the organic nitrogen sources. Some of these were much higher, either poultry litter, manure applications, or possibly legume crops. We're getting much higher, but if we kind of take the mean here, that was 20 to 40 pounds of N available for that cotton crop. So kind of wrapping up, this is where we hope to get, ultimately with the recommendations is taking all of the data we've gathered and then being able to extrapolate that to an economic optimum N rate. This graph here is for the 50 sites that were in South Carolina. So this is Bhupinder Farmaha, who's been leading this effort. He did his state first, and then he's going to expand that to the broader data set. But kind of the point of this is, you get about, in this case, about 0.5 total sold nitrogen. Very few sites are responsive to nitrogen application after that. You get below 0.5 grams per kilogram, then you do have considerable amount of nitrogen response sites, but it is highly variable, with some still not responding and then some very responsive sites. So there's still a lot of data analysis to be done here, but hopefully in the end, we can take in soil, take in the organic nitrogen sources, inorganic nitrogen sources, and be able to predict when a crop field is going to respond to nitrogen applications. And that information will be provided to the grower, and they can subtract that from the nitrogen being applied. So I'm going to wrap up here with the kind of a couple other points that I know growers are asking a lot of questions about. There's a lot of activity out there around ag biologicals, and many of them promoting these for increasing nitrogen use efficiency or making nitrogen for the cotton crop. And this is an asandry of, microorganisms for soil health, biological control, bio-based. But anyway, the point being, there's a tremendous number of companies out there that are in the biological area. And we're seeing them again a lot in cotton as well, where they're promoting it for increasing nitrogen use efficiency. So working with the Extension Cotton Specialist, there was a study in 2023, 2024, where they looked at 6 different biological products. And then we compared them to the different rate response. So each of those biological products were applied in conjunction with 40 pounds of N. I was visiting with the various companies. Most of them have been recommending you don't want to highly stress the cotton plant. Basically, the products are going to, add a little bit more nitrogen into the system. So we wanted to put those products out in conjunction with 40 pounds of N. And then this latter response, this nitrogen rate applications, will indicate whether, that was a responsive site or not. And on the left is where the locations were. And I just have one slide here, but it's basically is the same for 2023, 2024 for both plant uptake and for yield. So if you look at this, we did have a nitrogen rate response from applying nitrogen fertilizer. If you look at this, we have basically, we applied 40 pounds of nitrogen here. And over here on the right, we've applied 40 pounds of nitrogen plus the biological products. And there was no yield advantage to including those biologicals, in the, to applying those products to the cotton. Again, 2 years of data on this. We hope at some point there will be products that are successful in pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and making that available to the cotton crop. But from the products that have been evaluated thus far, it's not looking too encouraging at this point, but hopefully in some point in time we will look at that. And then also along the line of biologicals, there's very little regulatory oversight on what goes into those products. So we had a microbiologist with USDA, Tom Ducey, actually pulled samples from the different jugs and looked to see if what was on the label was actually in the jug. And 3 of the 6 had what they said was in the jug. The other 3, were either non-determinate or did not have what they said was in the jug. So again, it's kind of a buyer beware environment out there right now with these microbial products. And kind of takeaways, wrapping things up. Cotton needs about 40 to 45 pounds of N for the first bale, and likely less for any additional bale, probably 30 to 35 pounds. Most locations are going to have a significant amount of plant available nitrogen in the soil. And of the bank accounts there, and it's there for you to draw from. And then cotton plants should not be too lush at the end of the season. You should not be pushing those cotton plants lush and green at the end of the year. We should start seeing that plant wind down by the end of the year. And then there are many reasons to increase nitrogen use efficiency, which we've talked about. A better ROI for the grower, and then also an increased sustainability story for the cotton. And then to take actions, we talked about some of the 4Rs. There's definitely opportunities there to increase your savings from the appropriate application methods, to reduce volatility and runoff and leaching and things like that. Also, as we talked about, test your soil and water to determine and quantify the amount of plant available nitrogen there. Many of the commercial labs will test for nitrogen. Many of the state labs will test for nitrogen. So just find those labs. If you can't find them, contact me and I will help you find them. I would suggest, if you're just really getting into this, focus on the field with the highest potential for soil residual nitrogen. That's your peanut rotation fields. That's your soybean rotation fields. That's your fields that may have had much lower yield than you were expecting, in previous years. So maybe you applied nitrogen for 200 bushel corn last year and you only got 100 bushels out of it. Odds are there's quite a bit of nitrogen fertilizer left there for that cotton crop to use. I don't want anyone to go out of their safety factor with reducing their nitrogen rates, so just back it off at whatever level you feel comfortable. Back it off 10%, 25%. I think it's safe in a lot of cases to back it off 50%. But go with whatever you feel comfortable with. But in most situations, there's going to be soil nitrogen there that you can utilize that's already in the soil. You just need to test for it and take that into account. And then also, every farm is different. Soil types are different. Rotations are different. Find what works on your farm and do that by conducting, various strip tiles. Do your own comparisons. Do some treated with your normal rate, back it off, 25% and 50%, and see if you see a yield response. So just do those trials on your farm and get that level of comfort. And that wraps up the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions anyone may have, Stacy, at this point in time.